let's go ahead and go on to the next portion. And the next portion is in regards to logic models. And again, if you've been in this space for a period of time, you're very familiar with the idea of a logic model, and you probably have come across that before. And so one of the reasons why I don't include this as a separate element is because the way I think about logic models is that it's really just a part of theory of change. And indeed, that's actually how I think about it in terms of the definition. Just thinking about it as a pictorial representation of theory of change, but it's going to have a lot more detail. So thinking about the if and then, the do and the get, and now pulling that out more, and that's how we start to build the logic model. So let me give you a template, and then I'll walk through a couple of examples as well. So in a logic model, there are 6 elements, generally 6 elements, and they're around the inputs, which are about the resources that are needed to perform activities, what those actual planned activities are, and then the related outputs with that. And conceptually, again, if you want to kind of map onto that sentence that we've developed, that sentence maps onto that if part, that beginning part of that sentence, or the doing part. And then the other part would be the getting, or the then part. And that's when you're starting to get into your outcomes. And your outcomes are going to be short-term, intermediate, or long-term. And I should note that within this is that the amount of time or the scale in which you're looking at the time frame really has to do with the time length of the project. We just typically work with a lot of projects that are about 3 years in length, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. And so that's why, in terms of developing this template, that's why it's at 3 years. But sometimes you have a grant that's a year long, or sometimes you have a grant that's 5 years. So you want to adjust that piece, that time frame, or thinking about your short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes in regards to the length of time of the grant. So in thinking about that, still with step 1, still thinking about the theory of change, at the proposal stage, try to include a logic model for moderate and large grants. The reason why you definitely can include that for smaller grants, just trying to reduce out the amount of complexity around the evaluation plan, and because you may have limited space with that proposal, it's okay if you have a smaller grant that you're seeking funding for and you don't have a logic model at the proposal stage. I do think that to get the grant, that there's a lot of benefit of having the logic model. So you would want to develop it at that point, but just thinking about how can you simplify this process. So if it's a moderate large grant, try to make sure to have a logic model at that point. And so let me give you a couple of examples. Again, going back to this this grant that was provided by the Department of Ed, this is a moderate scale. And as you can see, you have the inputs associated with the project, what they have in terms of the mentors, advisors, the tutors, the equipment that's needed, and as well as they highlight the funding, the activities that are going to be planned, what they're expecting to do, and then the outputs, what they're actually looking at tied to those specific activities. And then you start seeing the outcomes, which are things that aren't necessarily under their direct control, but what they're expecting based on what they're doing with their activities and their outputs. So things like confidence, the self-efficacy increase, mindset increase, as well as retention, persistence increasing, and then ultimately that long-term goal of increasing the number of graduates who are pursuing either a STEM-related job or who are going on to a professional school. Here's another example again with the Department of Labor. This logic model looks a little bit different. This In this situation, we included in the context. We added some information about the context. And then that context was kind of leading to what those inputs are. So very similar in regards to what was needed to be able to get the whole process going, what would be needed to get the initiative off the ground, and then what were the kind of planned activities associated with that. And then what was expected in terms of the outputs, and the outputs with recruiting individuals and they're completing the number of certificates, things of that nature. And then what some of those outcomes are, short term, and then the long term outcomes. So even though these look very different, the key information still in the logic model. I do want to make a little note because I see this emerge often where if you think about what the funder's language is, it may be a little bit different than what the evaluation language is, and that could be confusing. So again, like what we're talking about outputs, we're talking about the actual number counts and what's actually directly tied to the activity. And sometimes that funder, for a number of reasons, may call that an outcome. And so if you are encountering those types of situations, one of the things I think is important and it's helpful is to really think about the definition in its broad terms and what that means at the conceptual level and what the vendor is asking in terms of at a broad point, and then kind of working back to what term they're using for that. I think if you use that strategy and that approach, that will be really helpful in terms of trying to align what would be kind of quote unquote traditional value language with what the funder's language is, right? So the take-home lesson from that portion is really around that a logic model that summarizes the theory of change is encouraged when you're working with a moderate and large scale evaluations. So I'm gonna kind of pause there for a moment and check in with Elise to see if there are any other questions.
Yes, there are several. The first is, if you can't include the logic model in the proposal package, is there still utility in completing it?
I think there is. I think there is. I think there's utility, even if it can't, because one of the challenges, and that's why, again, I was saying with a small scale, and this happens sometimes with a moderate scale, there's a spacing issue in terms of getting the logic model actually into the proposal. And so that sometimes teams that are working on proposals will run into that. But where I find the utility, and I'm thinking about two examples in particular, one actually earlier today when I was working with another individual on a project team, on a logic model, what it brings up are your assumptions and the kind of varied assumptions among the team members about the project. And it will bring up some issues in terms of conceptualization so that even if you can't technically get the logic model in the proposal, the ideas, thoughts that emerge from the logic model are reflected because the narrative itself gets tighter. So I do think there's benefit, and then sometimes things are just going really fast, though, that it's not done. So I understand if it doesn't get done, but at its best, I think it's really a lot of benefit to getting that logic model completed at the beginning, and then definitely if it's awarded, just getting some clarification on what the project is and things of that nature. So did you say there was another question, Elise?
Yes. As the evaluator, do you generate the logic model or do you expect the client, the grant recipient, to do so?
It's a good question. So it depends. I work with a lot of project teams that will develop initial draft, and I will give feedback on that. I work with project teams where I'm actually developing a finalized version of a logic model, and just kind of going through and kind of gleaning from the proposal what elements fit in terms of the activities and the outputs and things of that nature, and we'll review that. And because sometimes, if you're working on a proposal, you're flying the plane and building at the same time, it's going real quickly. Sometimes there's not the opportunity to create a formal logic model. So I almost always have an informal logic model that I've drafted out and that has some elements of that, because that helps me to be able to pinpoint what needs to be evaluated. So it's nice if the project team can start that process, because sometimes, depending on when you actually are engaging with the evaluator, it's hard to get it in a finalized place. Or if you start with an evaluator much earlier, that person probably will have enough time to get it finalized. But ultimately, there should be some back and forth between the evaluator and the project team in terms of finalizing out what that logic model looks like.